Hey there, welcome back to Oakley's DIY Home Renovation. I'm Kent and I'm renovating my house. It brings me to the outside where I'm going to be prepping for exterior painting. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is sanding. I know this is a little bit of an overkill and not necessary, but I'm doing it for three reasons. One, so that I can find any problems, cracks, caulking missing or caulking cracked, nails popped, rotted materials, those sorts of things. The other thing reason I'm sanding is because this is the original paint on the house from 2008. And if there's any chalking or flaking, I want to catch it, or peeling. By sanding, I'll catch it because I'll wind up going over every inch of it. And third, I'm just really OCD and think that I need to sand the whole house before I can paint it. I've just always had in my mind that you need to sand before you prime so that everything will have a good surface to stick to, and then you paint. I know a lot of them probably just go out there and they spot sand in areas and then they paint the whole house. I just can't do it. So come on with me. I'll show you what we're going to do. The tools I'll be using will be this palm sander. It's quite old. I've had it for many, many years. Works very well still, so I'll be using that. I'll be using this bigger version of a palm sander for the bigger areas, obviously. This hand sander in spots, a paint scraper, which I got from Home Depot, a painter's tool, and least but not least, sandpaper. So I've got some 180 grit here that I got at Sherwin-Williams. I'll leave links down below for the scraper and the sandpaper. These sanders are so old you won't find them unless somebody's selling them as antiques. But I got 180 grit sandpaper. I've got some 150 that I got somewhere else, and I've got some leftover 80 grit that I'm going to use. The 80 grit is going to be used in specific areas, which I'll point out and show you when we get to the sanding part, because it's really rough and I need to take it down and take it down quick and not be there all day at it. I'm going to try the 180 paper, but I think it may be a little too fine, and that's why I have the 150. If I don't like how the 180 is working, I'm going to go to the 150. All right, we're at the garage here, and you see we got our jam board, and it was in pretty rough shape as far as peeling and everything, and it was really rough. It had splatter marks and everything else. So as you can see, I've sanded that down, a lot of that, to bare metal, or I'm sorry, bare wood. And on the inside, which you can't see very well, but the inside here is also pretty much down to the bare wood. I did that all the way around. Not so bad up here. Again, you get to this side and it's peeled pretty bad, and I sanded it pretty hard. Now you'll notice here that the caulking's gone all the way down on both sides. It's because I pulled it out. It was cracked, it was pulled away, it was showing the seam. So I took all that out. What I'm going to do is I'll replace all that caulking. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to tape this brick off right to the edge and primer, so that I get primer on all that wood before I put any caulking. And then I'll come back behind and then caulk all this and paint the whole thing. As far as above the garage, you can see I've already sanded this, and I used 100 grit, and you can see I sanded a little too aggressive, and I got a lot of spots that I sanded through, and I got the fascia up here done on this side. Now I don't have any of that up there done. That's the next project. I'm actually kind of avoiding that because I got to get up high on a ladder to get to it. I've got another board over here. Again, this one was peeling really bad, and I sanded that down almost to completely bare. And again, there's caulking around here that was splitting away that I took out. And I got another one of these boards on the other side of the house I haven't got to, and we'll go look at that real quick. Here we are on the other side. You can see I haven't gotten to this one, but it's chipped a lot. I'll have to take my handy dandy painter's tool, work on that and sand that down really smooth. The caulking looks to be in good shape on this edge, so I won't need to tear that out. And then we got to move on down. Like I say, I pressure wash the whole house first. This side that we're on right now gets a lot of shade, so a lot of the house on the other side of the fence here had the green moldy stuff growing on there. Because of that, I'm down here in the Houston, Texas area, where it's high humidity and there's not a lot of sun, so that stuff builds up. So I had to pressure wash that off. Whereas at the rest of the house, where it gets a lot of sunlight, you do not have that issue. Using 180 grit sandpaper, we're going to sand the eave here. And hopefully we're not going to go through the paint like we did over there, but if we do, that's okay. We'll just have to primer. As you can see, I'm starting at the front of the house. I'm using my big sander to get the front of the fascia board there, just so it's quick and easy because I don't have to go back and forth with the smaller one. And here I'm using the smaller one to go underneath the fascia to get the vent holes of the eave and then the trim board that's sitting against the brick. I could use the bigger sander here, but the problem is that thing gets pretty heavy after a while holding it upside down. Now what I'm doing here is I'm doing the edge of that fascia board. All the edges on this hardy board are quite rough, and so I'm having to take 60 grit sandpaper to it to try and knock it down. And I'm doing it on the inside of that too, and I'll show you that inside is rough also. I'm just trying to smooth it down. As you can see, even with the 180 grit sandpaper in some areas, it didn't take much before you was all the way through the paint. And I didn't stay very long when I was sanding, so that I didn't try to do it. Now what you will see is I changed my sandpaper on the hand sander to do this inside edge and this bottom. And the reason is because this inside edge in some areas is not painted very well, and it's very rough. And it's rough on this edge here also, which you can't see. Let me get around here and see if I can get you a better picture. As you can see here, I've moved my equipment so I can get the gable end of the house over the garage, and I'm using my big sander there to get the front of the fascia board, and I'll also use it to do the siding part of it. And I'm using 150 grit sandpaper here instead of the 180. The 180 was just a little too slow at getting this material off. And here I'm using it to get the trim around that little decorative louver part that is on the house. And what I'm doing right now is removing some caulk off of each end on the bottom, because I didn't caulk the sides. Why, I don't know. So I'm leaving those as kind of weep holes, if you will, for rain to escape. And now I'm taking my small hand or palm sander, and I've put the 80 grit sandpaper on there. Earlier I said 60, and as my mistake, it's 80 grit sandpaper, and I'm doing the inside edge of the fascia board. I do the bottom edge of the fascia board. Any of the side edges of that hardy board gets sanded with the 80 grit because it's rough. In case you didn't know what hardy board is, it's basically wood fibers and cement, and that's why sometimes they call it cement board. But just because it has that cement in there doesn't mean it's waterproof. As I'll show you later, there's some edges that have come apart and are rotted. So there I am doing the underneath side, reaching up as far as I can with my hand sander. And then that decorative louver is all smooth wood, so I use the 80 grit to take it down as fast as I can to get the job done. And I do the sides, and I do the side edges also of the trim board, which is the hardy board, the textured stuff. And I'm using sandpaper. I'm using 80 grit sandpaper to get the areas that my palm sander couldn't get. And up in the louvers, it didn't get very well. And under each end of the eave, I couldn't get but so far either, so I have to go through there and hand sand it with the 80 grit. I'm not using the 150 because it just takes too long with the by hand. And now I'm moving my scaffolding system over to the other end of the eave to do that part. In case you're wondering what I'm using here, I got a little giant ladder and their scaffolding platform. The platform I have is a 9 to 15 foot, meaning it can stretch all the way out to 15 feet. And the ladder itself actually comes apart, and you can get a bracket to fit on each side of the two pieces to turn it into two 5-foot ladders, and that's what I've done. Now again, on this other side, I'm taking the big sander to all the areas I can, the front of the fascia board, the siding, and all of that. And you see I can't reach clear to the top. So what I've done here is I put my ladder back together and made it into an extension ladder to reach up there. In case you're wondering what that silver bar is, that's also an add-on that you can get for the little giant ladders so that it stands away from the house and the ladder doesn't rest on the shingles. As you notice, I have no gutters. So it's just more of the sanding with the 80 grit on the edges, the 150 on the flat surfaces. My sander won't reach in some of that top peak there, and so here in a little bit I'll have to take the 80 grit sandpaper and just do it by hand. And then also I come back around and get more of that decorative louver area also with the 80 grit on the hand sander. In doing these areas, it takes a lot more time than just the flat surfaces because I have to switch back and forth from 150 grit sandpaper to 80 grit. You've got all these edges that have to be done. I got that inside edge that's rough that has to be done. I got the edge of the hardy board itself. And then you actually got the eave where the vents are and the front of that trim board. And then you see there's an edge to that trim board that I have to go back and do with the 80 grit. Now I've moved my ladder over so I can get the rest of the areas where I couldn't reach with the scaffolding and where my ladder was before. And I just make sure I get all of it done. All right, front of the house is all done. And those of you watching this, you know you watched just to see if I was going to fall off that ladder. That's all right. I'd have done the same. But I didn't. So, front of the house is done. Now it's time to go over to the side. And I've already started on this board here. And you can see that all this paint's gone. When I hit this with the sander, that stuff just flakes right off. Comes right off. It's not really held on there very well. So that's why it's sanding down. So we're going to start over here and get this side. Okay, so I've got the scaffolding system set up on the side of the house here. And I'm using my small palm sander there with 80 grit sandpaper to get the bottom edge of the fascia, and I'll get the inside edge or surface of it also with that. And then again, there's a 1x2 trim board up there at the top that's smooth and has no texture, and I'll use the 80 grit on it also. How I found out that these boards were so rough up here is when I pressure washed the house, I didn't pressure wash the eave because I didn't want water going up through the vent slots and getting into my attic and getting my insulation wet. So I actually hand washed that with soap, water, and a brush. And as I was washing it, I would hit those edges and get little scratches and scrapes on my hand. So that's why I went to sanding those. Now I'm sanding that trim board there, the face of it, and I have switched back to the 150 grit sandpaper on my small palm sander. There are some areas you'll see me take out my 5-in-1 tool and remove caulking that is cracked or pulled away from the seam where the brick meets the hardy board. Now I'm back up there doing the fascia with the 150, do the underneath with the 150, and we'll do the whole siding of the house with the 150 grit sandpaper. Like I say before, the eave is the hardest part. It's got all these little edges and small areas that have to be done. And when you get to the house part itself, it goes pretty quick. Here I am switching to my big sander to get the siding. And it doesn't take long to where I get down far enough where I can stand on the ground and finish everything. And that scaffolding system makes it quick and easy. There I am now on the ground, getting the rest of it. As you see, doing the siding of the house goes really quick compared to when I have to do the soffit. Even if you take into account, yes, I have to use the scaffolding system and move it each time, it still takes longer just to do the soffit area, and it's really a smaller area by square foot than what it takes to do the siding. So now I'm over on the side of the house where it gets all the sun, and I decided to do what I could do standing first, so I don't have to move the scaffolding system just yet. And you see it's going by really quick. It doesn't take much, and the 150 sandpaper actually works really well. I have many focal areas where sanding took it down to the bare wood. Some of that I know is because the board is textured, but also I feel that the paint is thin in those areas and it's taken it off compared to others, because I have ridges that are higher than some of those that are down to the bare wood that the paint didn't come off of. Now what I'm doing here is I found a seam where the siding boards meet up, where the caulking is cracked away from one side or the other, and I'm pulling that out using my 5-in-1 tool to see how bad it is. And then later on I'll have another video where I repair all of those. Now we're down to the bottom part of the house here. As you see, it didn't take very long to get this done. Now I will have to use the smaller sander to get around those electrical boxes, and I'll actually have to do some hand sanding around those. When it comes time to paint, I'm going to tape and mask those off, and I'm not going to paint those. I've been mixed emotions as whether to paint or not paint the cable boxes, but I definitely am not going to paint the electrical panel or the electrical meter boxes when I do paint. There's an overflow pipe down there for the hot water heater that I had to kind of hand sand around. And then that other pipe you see is the wiring for the sprinkler system. Here I am doing the smaller sander around the electrical boxes, and then in a little bit you'll see me do some hand sanding. And again, with any hand sanding, I'm using the 80 grit just so I can get it done and get it over with. Since I'm hand sanding, I can gauge how much I'm taking off, and I'm not taking off near as fast as I am with the power sanders. Now it's time to do the upper part of the house. I got my scaffolding system set up there. I'm using the big sander to do the siding part first, and I did the front of that fascia board with it since I had the paper in there and I had it out and running, because I only run one extension cord, and so between each sander I have to unplug one and plug the other one in. And again, using that scaffolding system makes it quite nice, versus if I just had ladders and I had to go up one ladder and back down and move the ladder and go up and back down. So now I'm using the smaller hand sander, and I've switched the paper out to do the rough surfaces, which would be the 80 grit. Again, the bottom of that fascia board, the inside edge of that fascia board, and then there's that 1x2 trim up at the top that I use it for. Now you'll see as we get further around, I've got trim boards that run vertical around the corners, and so the edges of those boards all get sanded. Here we are, moved down a little bit further, doing up over that window. Up over that window, the siding, I have to do it by hand because the sander won't fit in there. And also, again, that's a trim board that has a rough edge, so I'll use the 80 grit sandpaper to sand the edges of those trim boards. And then I'll have to switch back to the 150 to do the front facing of the boards. I've moved down, and you see there's my little dog Gracie. If you can tell, her left leg hair's been shaved. She's recovering from knee surgery, and she's kind of out there relaxing, checking out what I'm doing, see if I'd come down and play. And since I don't, she kind of just wanders around. But here we are doing the inside of that fascia board with the 80 grit, and she's coming back to make sure I won't come down and play. And I'm checking to see how smooth it is and if I've taken all the paint off, because as I look underneath there when I'm doing it, there are areas I've taken it down to the bare wood. And as I mentioned earlier, there's just the area itself I don't feel was painted very well, because even before I sanded, you could see the texture of the fascia board, the bare wood, through the paint. This is quite tedious to do, the soffit, and it does make quick work when you're doing it down on the ground, as you see. And I don't know if you can tell or notice, but the bottom of those corner trim boards are bad, and a little later in another video I'll go through and show you how I test which ones are no good and which ones I'm going to replace and which ones I'm going to keep. Here I am moving the scaffolding system down, get the last little bit of the soffit on the end of the house. Like I say, it does take a little time to move this around, but it does make it a lot nicer to do a large area of the house with the scaffolding system versus having to get up and down off of a ladder. Now, these corners on the back of the house were good. They weren't cracked like the front were, and so I didn't have to take the caulking out. There I am doing the bottom edge of that trim board with the 80 grit sandpaper. And now I'm doing the side, and I'll do that all the way around the windows, and I'll do it on the edge sides of the trim boards. And get more sandpaper. These short parts of the house that you see here, the one I'm doing now and then the one over there by the air conditioner, actually go quite fast, but the area under the porch does take a lot of time. Again, there's a lot of surfaces there in the eave that have to be done. And also the ceiling under that porch, the wood is very, very rough. The plywood that they used while it's painted is very rough, and I have to sand quite a bit on that just to get it down. There you see I'm doing the edge of the trim boards. Now there I have my big sander, and I try to reach as high as I can with it standing on the ground, so I don't have to be on the scaffolding this long. And it goes faster when I'm on the ground. Here we have the scaffolding set up on the back of the house. And again, I'm doing the soffit area. And I switch back and forth. It depends on what paper is in the sander, but if the 150 grit sandpaper is in the small one, I'll usually use it to get the face of the fascia board. If it's not, which it wasn't, it was the 80 grit, then I'll use the big sander. And then I take the 80 grit and do all the rough edges, and then switch to the 150 to get the smaller areas. Just trying to cut down on as much switching back and forth of the paper as I can. All in all, when doing this house, you might think I went through a lot of sandpaper, and I really didn't. That 80 grit held up quite nicely. The 150 actually did too. So, I mean, I didn't even go through a box of sandpaper to do the whole house. There I am switching sandpaper again. And again here over the windows, the area is too small for the sander to fit in there. So I go back with my 80 grit and hand sand. Now I'm setting up for underneath here. And you can see those paint splotches is where we did our test spots for to see what color we're going to paint the house. And then I went back and pressure washed, and some of it come off with the pressure washer and other didn't. I was a little surprised at how well it stuck to the surface. But again, the surface was clean because I had pressure washed the house before we painted it. The door there is going to be a separate issue. I'm not going to do this door or the front door while I'm doing the sides of the house, because they need a little extra work. And you may notice on that wall I'm working on right now, that black area, that's where I had the grill, and the smoke from the grill would vent on the house. And I tried and tried to get that stuff off. I used a pressure washer, I used soap in the pressure washer, I hand scrubbed with a brush and detergents, and it just won't come off. But when I primer it, it'll hide it, and then painting over it, it'll be gone. Now I'm doing the trim board around the door but I'm not actually going to sand the jamb. And the reason is there's been some damage to the jamb that has to be repaired, in which I'll do a video on that where I'm going to use Bondo to repair it, and I'll sand it all then. And I'm reaching as high as I can to avoid getting the scaffolding system in there. Now I use the ladders like this, but when I go to do the top ceiling part, I will have the scaffolding system set up in there so I can do a large area back and forth instead of up and down on the ladder. And like I say, this area here takes a fair amount of time because there's a lot of surfaces in there that have to be done. There's trim boards in those corners that are smooth that I take the 80 grit to, and I have to hand sand some of that because it's too small to use the sander on. And then I've got the 1x2 trim board up around the top that has to be done. And then that area where I just had my hand, that is on the side I'm sanding right now is textured, but on the bottom it's textured, but the edges have to be sanded by themselves with the 80 grit because they're rough. And when I say rough, I mean when you go run your hand over them, they are rough. And then after I sand, they're quite smooth. But the other thing I noticed is after I would sand, there would be pockets where there's no paint. So when I primer, I'll make sure I primer well on the edges to get paint up in there. And then when I paint the color on, do the same so that I can block any water going up inside there and causing any rot. And I don't know if you've noticed, but when I first started doing this area, I just had a red long sleeve shirt on, and now I have gloves and a sweatshirt. And we had a cold snap there where it got down in the 30s here, which isn't very common. And so I had to kind of bundle up to get this sanding done because the cold was going to last for 2 or 3 days and I didn't want to ride it out. You may notice that scraper sticking out of my back pocket. I always have my scraper in one pocket and my painter's tool in the other in case I need it. While this part of the video spends quite a bit in this area, it's because of all those surfaces that have to be done. Now there we are. We got my scaffolding system set up to do the ceiling part. There is a light there, but I didn't take it down. I will take it down to paint, and I'll sand under it at that time. But I wanted to leave it up for now so we'd have a back porch light. But with the scaffolding, I can go from one end to the other and not have to move the ladders. That's the one nice thing. But you might tell my arms are getting quite tired holding that bigger sander up to do this area. So what I thought I'd show you is why I'm sanding up under here so much is because this here was all very rough. And then I'm taking those boards, those trim boards up there on the edge. They're not textured. It's just flat wood. So I don't mind going down to the bare wood on that. But all this up here was very, very rough. So all those flat trim boards get sanded very hard. And even if it takes the paint down. And then these edges here were very rough, all the way around. They're very rough. So I'm smoothing those out with 80 grit sandpaper. And you can see I don't have complete paint coverage. So when I repaint this, I'll make sure I get paint all up in there. All right, we moved on to the eave part over the porch. As I mentioned before, this is the most time consuming and tedious part of it because of the switching of the sandpaper back from 150 to the 80 grit and then back again, and having to use the 2 different sanders, the big one and the small one. But it does make it a little nicer having the little giant ladder platform system there. As you see, I'm on the 2nd rung, which is about 2 foot up. They don't recommend going higher than the 3rd rung, which would be 3 feet. Above there, it gets a little top heavy and scary as you're walking around. As you'll see in a minute, as I get further around this side here, I have to go up over that air conditioner to get to the eave and stuff. You see me here sanding that border trim, and a little later videos, we'll talk about how I'm going to probably replace most of those, but at this time I'm going ahead and sanding them anyway, just so I don't have to worry about coming back and sanding in case I decide not to remove or replace it. Now you see I'm on this back side of the house there where I had to go over the air conditioner, and how I had to take the scaffolding or the plank up to the 4th rung on the left side there, but I left it in the 3rd rung on the right side there, so it wouldn't be so top heavy and it more of a danger of falling over. But it does get a tad bit shaky when I'm on that towards that left side. Now here I am on the final side of the house, on the home stretch, if you will. I've only got just this side of the house, and then this part of the project is done. And believe me, it was hard not to just kind of whip through it and be done, since it's taken so long to get this part of the project finished. Now you won't be able to tell here, but when I'm doing the siding part of the house, up on this end there were some cracks in the plank, and they kind of popped out. I'm not sure why. They weren't in the areas where nails were, so I don't know why they were doing that. But I'll sand extra right there and actually take down the texture off of it, and a small part of it, and then later I'll come back and caulk that. I'm not going to try and attach those popped up pieces back down. Instead, I'm just going to caulk under them and around them to hold them there so they won't go any further and water won't get behind them. But I sanded extra there, so when I come to do the caulking, I'll see that there's a lot of sanding marks in one area, and it'll draw my attention to go investigate and fix whatever the problem is there. We're getting ever closer to the end here, and I decided to just do all the sanding I could off of the scaffolding system. And in fact, you see me right there reach as high as I possibly can so that I don't have as much to do once I'm up there, because at this point I've had about all the fun I can take of the sanding and can't wait to be done. And so that way all I have left is really the tedious part on the scaffolding to get done. Now when you go to do your house, you don't have to have the scaffolding system like I have here. You can just use a ladder, but make sure you get a really good ladder, because this is an area where you shouldn't skimp. Spend extra money, get a really good ladder, get one that's got at least a 250-pound rating. They do make a heavy-duty ladder that's rated at 300 pounds, but there is a significant price jump from the 250 weight rating to the 300. So I do highly recommend these little giant ladders. I'm not getting anything from the company by mentioning them. I just really think they're a good ladder. It has been a long journey to get to here, and as the pop-up says, if you've made it this long, I really do thank you. But we truly are near the end of this phase of the house, and done with the sanding part of it, and can move on to something a little more exciting. So getting the last little bit of that eave done with the 60 grit, or I'm sorry, the 80 grit on the small sander, and then I'll switch back to the other sandpaper and that sort of stuff, and then we'll be done. And when I finished, I did do a happy dance, but I think my battery went dead in my camera when that came about. And by the time I realized that, I was too tired to worry about going back and retaking another shot of it. Okay, well, I'd finished sanding everything, and I'd sanded all above here on the back patio, and the same over the front patio, if you will, area and door. I got to looking, and if you see those areas that are exposed right there, they look like they've got some black material, possibly mold or something growing in them. And I'm a little nervous about painting over that. So what I'm going to do is take my belt sander and sand that down and get rid of that. So when I primer and paint, I don't have to worry about it. I kind of did a test spot over here that you can see where it kind of got that out. So I'm not sanding through multiple layers of the plywood. I'm just trying to get that black stuff out of there, and at the same time it'll make it a little smoother. All right, so I got my Makita belt sander here. And like my other sanders, it's an old version. It's a 86 model, but it still works real well. But if you've never used one of these, they can be a little intimidating and tricky because they can be very aggressive as far as taking wood down. You can wind up cupping a board real easy if you're not careful. The biggest thing to remember is you just keep going. Don't sit in one spot, especially when I got this 80 grit sandpaper. It's going to get pretty aggressive, as you'll see. You just got to keep moving. Don't sit still or bear real hard and you'll do fine. With this particular model, you pull this lever up here, paper slides out, new piece slides in, close the lever, and then you turn it on, and this adjusting knob right here makes the paper move one way or another. And I got a collection bag on here. So we'll get started and we'll whip this out hopefully pretty quick. You might notice that there's no ladder in the camera there or scaffolding systems because I'm using my new Gorilla work platform that I just bought, and I'll leave a link below where I did a product review on it. But it's much easier to move around, and since I don't have a very big area, it made it really simple. Now as we get going here, you'll see that the coat of paint on this area was fairly thick, as it takes just a little bit to get through it down to the wood, but even that I'm not getting all of it off, and I'm trying not to go through a layer of the plywood at the same time. I'm just wanting to get rid of that black stuff that's in between the grains of the wood and have it smooth at the same time. Now you notice as I'm sanding this, I'll sand with the sander in one direction, and then I'll turn it 90 degrees and sand the same area with it in that direction. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I get it an even sanding. I don't want to just sand one direction and worry that I might be cupping out some of the wood. So I sand it in two different directions. So if that's happening, I can hopefully get it sanded out. Okay, you can see I got all this finished, and in doing so, it took quite a bit of the paint off. But I got rid of all those black lines that I was worried about. It's nice and smooth. And then when I paint it, I'm sure that'll help it even better. So with that, that officially ends the sanding phase. Please hit the subscribe button down below and ring the bell. All right, so after many days and quite a few hours, the house is finally sanded. Yeah, it was a lot of extra work, probably not needed, but I learned quite a few things by doing so, and that is I found problem areas that need to be addressed. I got a lot of nails that are backed out that need to be set. I got areas that need attention as far as caulking. I got some cracks. I got some rot to replace. So while it was a lot of work, it was worth it. So with that said, now we're on to the next step or part of the exterior preparation, and that is what I'm going to call the fix-it phase. So first I'm going to wash down the house here with some water to get all the sanding dust off, and then move on to the next step. So if you like the video, hit the thumbs up part down there, and if you want to be notified for the next one, hit the subscribe button down there and ring the little bell so you'll get notified when the next video comes out. See you then.